Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski. What I wanted to do with this lecture is I wanted to kind of just create a lecture where we talk about the appointment in Sammara, because sometimes students struggle with this fable. So I think, if I kind of talk a little bit about it, and I can help you to better understand the fable itself. So notice, we've started off our class, we've talked about short stories. We're going to shift and bring in a couple of fables, and all a fable is a real short story, right? So notice the appointment in Sammara isn't any longer than basically a body paragraph, but there's a lot to the story if you unpack it. And if you think about linking it either mythically or thematically, there's some really great ideas in the appointment of Sammara. So, and I often sometimes get students who, if I'm in a ground class, they'll read it and I ask them, what they think of the story, and they're really confused. So I think that's why I really want to create this video. So if we look at the appointment of Sammara, the first thing I ask students is, where is the story set, right? So we know that the story is set in Baghdad, right? And so if we look in, we zoom into Baghdad, and boom, we're in a really small, we're in a crowded market, right? There's all sorts of people, right? And we meet the servant, and the servant is bumping into people left and right. And I always think, what it would be like to be in a market in Baghdad, right? Because there'd be a lot of people. Think about all the cool things you could see. And all of a sudden, the servant turns the corner, and the servant sees death. And death kind of points at the servant. So the servant freaks out, and he runs back to his master. He grabs the horse, and he runs off, and he goes all the way off to the town of Sammara. And the master finds out about this, and the master he's furious, right? So he goes back to the market, and he's pushing people out of the way, and he sees Death, and he gets right in Death's face, and he says, "Death, what's up? Why are you making fun of my servant?" And Death says, "I wasn't making fun of him. I was surprised to see him because I have an appointment with him a little later today." And notice, sometimes I'll ask students if they find the appointment in Sammara funny. And some students think it's really funny. I think, oh, that's really great. You find the story funny, but the servant is going to die, right? So notice, if we look at the appointment of Sammara at a real simple level, right, what this story is about fate, right? It could be about fate and death. And maybe we might say it's about fate and how you can't escape fate. And these are all simplistic themes, right? These are all easy themes. But if you pick back and you go back a little bit deeper, there's a lot more to the story itself. So notice, one of the things that I left out is, notice Death in this story, or in this fable, is a woman. And that changes everything, because think about it, in our Western view, right, we know that we think of Death kind of more the traditional figure, the hooded figure, maybe it has a Sith, right, a bony figure, but it's a game changer if you make Death a woman. And think about it, it actually makes sense, because each one of us is born from a woman. So why is it that when we die, would not Death then be a woman? It makes a lot of sense. And then think about setting the story in Baghdad, in the Middle East, where women often are treated as second-class citizens, right? Where women are treated very poorly. There's some great irony about Death being a woman, and that allows a theme to come into the story of feminism. And so what if the servant was afraid of women? He turned, he saw a corner, he saw a beautiful woman, he freaked out, and he left, right? So maybe, what if he's afraid of women? And that could open up to some, LGBTQ themes as well. But I think it's really interesting, and how it might change the story if we ask, well, why is Death a woman here? Now, the other theme that's pretty easy is, don't be afraid of death, right? Because notice, the servant was afraid of death, but the master was not. He got right in Death's face, right? I mean, he confronted Death, right? So maybe don't be afraid of death, right? What would have happened if the servant had said, "Hey, why are you pointing at me?" And Death might have said, "Well, I have an appointment with you, a little later today." And said, "Well, how do you know?" "Well, let's take a look at my book." "Oh, yeah, hey, you do have an appointment with me in Sammara, but look, it's 20 years later." And Death can be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, my bad." Now, there's also an interpretation of the stories that, what if Death has a sense of humor? I mean, what if Death is kind of bored. You know, I mean, he's going around. Where does he go? He goes to old folks' homes, right? He goes to the cemetery. He's just kind of bored. And so Death kind of looks over and says, hey, you know what? I think I'm just going to point at that random person. Oh my God, did you see that person run and jump away? So what if the story is like Death himself or herself is a product of fate, and that Death is bored, or Death has a sense of humor? But notice, if we peel back and we look at these, all of a sudden these themes make this fable a lot more interesting. And I'll tell you, sometimes students have the best themes that these stories would deal with. So several years ago, so give or take, right, it's 2024. So you'd have to imagine that this is probably like 12, 14 years ago. But I had a student who was a vet who had served in Iraq. And he said he thought that the story was a reflection of the war in Iraq. And I said, well, how did you come up with that idea? Well, he said, the story is about Death, and he had been part of the initial invasion of Baghdad in Iraq back in 2003, and then he served several years. But he said, and he had lost some friends or some comrades, soldiers, in during the war. And he said, well, here's the thing, right? The story's set in Baghdad. It was really easy, for the most part, when the initial invasion of Iraq began. U.S. was able to easily get to Baghdad, occupy Baghdad, and we thought the war was going to be easy. And in Sammara, there is a beautiful church. It's this beautiful Islamic church, and it was a couple of months after everyone thought the war in Iraq was over, and terrorists blew up that church. And it was when everyone realized, oh my God, the war in Iraq is not going to be as easy as people thought. And, you know, while that's, you know, that might be kind of a bit of a stretch, notice it's an interesting theory to apply to the story, and it makes for a much more interesting analysis to make a really strong paper. So you want to sometimes, when you think about writing about or think about a story, go big and bold in your ideas. See where they take you, because students come up with the best possible ideas sometimes. So I hope this video helped just kind of give you an understanding and maybe a better appreciation of the appointment in Sammara.